Well, as we begin this morning, where I want to begin is just with a little bit of a slight backup, a little bit of an introduction into this passage. And, one of the things that I think can get missed in all of this is if we go back just a little bit from where we were to the end of chapter 1, when Ruth makes this decision to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem, back to the territorial area of Judah, in Israel, to a foreign land. She's a Moabite. This is a foreign country that she has decided to go to. Well, if we hit the rewind button a little bit in time, we go back to the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, there's this terrible scene where the children of Israel are traveling through the land of Moab as they're wandering in the wilderness. They're not exactly lost, but they're wandering in the sense that they didn't get to take the direct route. The Lord led them in a very roundabout way because he had to take them through various trials on their way to get there in order to produce the kinds of faith that was needed for them to enter the promised land that they lacked at Kadesh Barnea when they didn't go into the land. And so they came across Moab, and they came across a king of Moab named Balak, and he didn't like them one bit. So Balak hired Balaam, this prophet from a faraway town that was known as a center of pagan worship, and he specifically wanted Balaam to curse the Israelites. Well, as you may know, if you've read this story in the book of Numbers, this plan backfires. And all Balaam can do is utter words of blessing and not cursing. And so this really, really frustrates King Balak. And so he regroups, and the two of them put their heads together, and they come up with Plan B, which is the honeypot plan, which is kind of something that's been in the news recently. But basically the idea is to send these Moabite women in to seduce the Israelite men. So these Moabite women come in to seduce the Israelite men in order to basically wreck their faith, to get them away from the Lord God and to get them to worship the idol Baal. Well, sadly, this plan B works. But the whole point of this wandering through the wilderness, or this taking the scenic route through the wilderness, maybe we should say, is that God is trying to strengthen and build up the faith of his people and get them to know him personally. And so this is just the opposite of what needs to be happening. And so the Lord establishes his own curse, and we read about it in the Torah, that the Moabites were not allowed to be part of the assembly. So when the nation of Israel would gather as one, they would all come together for a national gathering. Moabites were not to be included for 10 generations in such gatherings. So there was this distaste in Israel for the Moabites. We could say that in a sense the Moabites were not particularly welcome in Israel, or at least they were looked on suspiciously, or they were stereotyped as hostile, wicked, promiscuous idolaters. There was this kind of undercurrent that was there in regard to the Moabites. But Ruth, as a Moabite woman, voluntarily moved to Israel, knowing that she would be dealing with this kind of lingering prejudice. But she was willing to endure it out of her love for Naomi and her trust in the God of Israel, who she knew something about, she had heard about, but she herself didn't at this time know. He wasn't yet her God, but she was ready to come under his authority and protection. So interestingly, when in chapter 2, Ruth encounters Boaz, there's this dialogue between Boaz and his foreman, and he wants to know, who's this young woman who's gleaning out here in my field? And the foreman identifies Ruth as a Moabitess. And I wonder if when he said that, there was a bit of a certain animosity with which he said she's a Moabitess. He didn't have particularly good feelings for her. That would have been common in Israel. And in addition, anytime Ruth would identify herself, I'm Ruth the Moabitess, if, it was kind of a little bit of a slinking, realizing that phrase, that qualifier, may have been met with unwelcome looks and dismissive comments being muttered. But Boaz, I think we see something so remarkable about him. He grew up, what we know about him from his genealogy is he grew up the son of a Canaanite former prostitute named Rahab. That was his mother. And he has probably grown up all his life around people that, didn't really have a high view of him or his family. At least there was a certain amount of disapproval, and he had to contend with that through his life. And so when Boaz meets Ruth, he's not dissuaded by the fact that she's a Moabite. In fact, instead of treating her dismissively or treating her badly, astonishingly, he treats her with this really overabundance of kindness and generosity and protection and provision. And so we're instantly told, we instantly see backed up the first thing we read about Boaz in chapter 2, that he is he's a mighty warrior, he's a man of renown, but he's also a man of character, and we see that right off the bat. Just to review real briefly, we don't have to take a lot of time on this morning, but just what we covered last week, chapter 2, verse 18 through chapter 3, verse 11. A few things to highlight is, one thing we looked at is these responsibilities of the Redeemer. And so a Goel, a Redeemer, is something that Boaz is called. There were these 5 things that they could do if the circumstances necessitated it. They could avenge the death of a loved one or relative who was murdered. They could marry the widow of a deceased brother. They could buy back land that a family member had been forced to sell due to financial ruin, and that comes into view here in our passage today, as well as verse number 4 there, buy back a family member who had become enslaved due to financial ruin. So they basically had to just sell themselves into the servitude of someone else because their debts overwhelmed them. Or number 5, look after needy and helpless family members. So someone had become destitute in their family, and they could step in to help them. We noted last time that Naomi had been struggling. Naomi had really struggled with her attitude, with her perspective, with her outlook. She, in her view, came back to the land empty. She went out full. She came back empty. God had obviously dealt harshly with her in her view, and she became depressed. But what happens here in chapter 2 into chapter 3 is that once Boaz comes into Ruth's life, Naomi's attitude and outlook change on a dime. They change very, very quickly. Because what we're seeing from her is she's moving from being self-focused and wallowing in her grief and her sadness to having no longer that perspective. Now she's focused on Ruth and on what's happening in Ruth's life and how she can support and give wise counsel to Ruth, come alongside her and help her in what she sees now that God is obviously doing in an unexpected way, working in Ruth's life and by extension in her life. So we noted last time that it's only when our focus switches from ourselves, our world, our worries, and our problems onto others and their best interests and their problems that we can experience liberation from the prison of fear and control and find the joy that God offers to us. As we moved through this passage, we also saw God's plan of redemption come into view. This common thread that was being woven through the story of Ruth. And one of the curious aspects that we noted last time is that this whole scene there in the first part of chapter 3 falls under this very suspicious circumstances. As you read about it, you're naturally thinking, okay, what is going on here? This sounds like really an inappropriate situation that's unveiling before us, and this really is getting into the area of sexual immorality. But as we read the passage, we see that could have gone in a southward direction, and it didn't. It went in an upright direction. It went in an upstanding direction because of the character of Boaz and Ruth. But we noted that all this to say there's imagery that's important there. There's foreshadowing there in terms of what God would be doing in the birth of the Messiah. He was said all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 to be born of the seed of the woman. Nothing was said about him being born of the seed of the man, though, was it? Because what would ultimately happen was a supernatural birth by way of the Holy Spirit coming together with a woman for the most extraordinary thing in all of history, God becoming human, taking on human flesh, and the Messiah being born in this way to be fully human and fully God at the same time. This had never happened before, has never happened, will never happen again. This was a complete anomaly, unique situation, but God had it planned from the beginning. And so, by its very nature, the birth of the Messiah had to come about under these sort of suspicious or under the shadow of suspicion type circumstances. And so we see that this scene follows that pattern of the preempting what is to come by way of the birth of the Messiah, because we're dealing with the line of the Messiah at this point, as this chapter, as Ruth will unfold. We also noted last time the wording that Ruth uses. It's rendered in most of our Bibles, spread the corner of your garment over me. But it really is extend your wing over your servant is what Ruth is saying. She's saying, take your servant under your wing. I want to come under your protection as Boaz, her close relative, the one who's able to do this for her. So she recognizes that God is the one who, as Boaz has stated, she has sought refuge under his wing, and now she's making the appeal of Boaz to do the same thing as an extension of this over her, to take care of her and to bring her in to protect her. So she requests God's protection and provision that it would directly involve Boaz. And, for those that have taken the view that this scene was wrong and Ruth needs to be rebuked for it, we don't see anything in the text by way of Boaz being offended, of Boaz being upset. Startled, yes. I think it spooked him out of his mind. He jumps significantly is the wording that we see. But he sees Ruth's actions as biblically consistent, and her character and her motives as being selfless in wanting to continue to put Naomi first and her interests ahead of her own. So that brings us into our passage this morning. We'll pick up where we left off last time. Chapter 3, verse 12 this morning. Reading our text, now it is true that I am a close relative. This is Boaz's answer to Ruth. However, there is a relative closer than I, he says. So Boaz responds to Ruth's request with full transparency. He acknowledged that there was a relative who was more closely related to him, and he was committed to protecting that man's rights. So he didn't want to step in. He didn't want to overstep. He didn't want to interfere at this point. So Boaz was already, I think that's what's interesting, is Boaz is already aware, and I think Naomi was too. They knew the family relationship. I think everybody, family members tend to know, this is my uncle, this is my cousin, how we're all related. And he knew, as well as Naomi did, the legal aspects of the situation. And so he's able to just answer Ruth immediately. He doesn't need to go searching for an answer somewhere. He knew of this family relationship. He knew that he was not the nearest relative to be able to step into this situation. So there was presumably a cousin or an uncle that was closer. Look at verse 13 here. he says to her, and this is where it gets really interesting. His response to her is, "Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you. As the Lord lives, lie down until morning." So much going on here in this passage. Again, Boaz doesn't get upset with Ruth or tell her to get out of here, go home in the middle of the night. Why? Primarily because that would have been highly unsafe for her to just be, the whole situation. She's come out there, presumably in the dusk or the evening hours, but now it's night. And I don't know if you've ever been in a place where in our world, everything is lit up. Buildings have lights, houses have lights, street lights, everything is lit up at night. It's not that dark. But if you go to a place where there are no lights in a city or, near in the outskirts of a city at dark, it's very dark, and it's the perfect covering for criminal activity. And so this would have been a sketchy, unsafe situation for Ruth to go back home. So he tells her, just stay put. Don't go anywhere. Just lie down, just sleep here until the morning. And he takes this oath. He says, "As the Lord lives." And I think we can read over this and not catch how profound this is. Because we read this passage in light of where we're at as New Testament believers, and we're like, oh, of course the Lord lives, right? Jesus rose from the dead. He's the God who conquered death. He's the God who lives, of course. But this is so far back in biblical history that Boaz has a unique perspective. He knows that the God of Israel is unique, that he is the living God. He's not the God made with human hands. He's not some prophet who lived and died and he's buried somewhere. He's the living God, and Boaz knows him. So this is a very, very profound statement. And the Apostle Paul, I think, picks up on this in the New Testament as well. He says, "As the Lord lives, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess Jesus Christ is King of Kings, Lord of Lords." And so probably an allusion to this statement here. But Boaz gets it. He understands that God is the living God and that he's unique among all the gods around of the nations. And this is also the most serious and binding oath that a Jewish person could place himself under. And he does it voluntarily. He associates himself with the living God. He says, as certain as God lives, I will do this. So this is an oath of all oaths here by Boaz. And what this statement demonstrates is that Boaz had a faith that was, let's just say, real. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't ethereal. It was genuine, and it was biblical, and it was personal. Because he had an accurate knowledge of who God is, a personal knowledge of him, and his nature and his attributes. And he says it this way, as he says about this next closer relative, if he says, if he will redeem you, great, let him redeem. But if he won't, and then the Hebrew says, actually bend down is literally the word. If he won't bend down to redeem you, to bring you out of the situation, if he won't bend down to redeem you, I will personally redeem you. The word there is anoki in Hebrew, and it's very simply in English, I, which doesn't really do anything. We say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that all the time. But for instance, in Spanish, if you say, yo soy, you can add emphasis by adding your own first-person personal pronoun to it, and Hebrew's the same way. And so that's what Boaz does here. He adds it. He says, I will do this. He doesn't have to say that in the wording of it, the construction. He says, I will personally. So he's saying, he's adding that for emphasis. He's saying, you can count on this. I will do this. So very strong wording here from Boaz, and it just completely is consistent with his character. Now let's see how this plays out. So Ruth does this. He does exactly as Boaz tells her, says she lay at his feet until the morning. So that's where she began. That's where Boaz encountered her, startled him, scared him half to death. And so he says, just sleep in that same spot. That's going to be fine for now. And then it says, and she arose, and that's a good rendering there, before a man could recognize his friend. So this tells us this was a colloquial saying for the pre-dawn hours when it's still dark. Maybe the sun is starting to come up, but it's still really, really dark. And it goes on to say, then he said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Now this is really interesting because you get into Boaz's head at this point. This is what he says out loud. And all the commentators want to know who's Boaz conversing with, right? And part of the problem is with the way this gets rendered. The Hebrew literally says, it can't be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Boaz is saying, this is what the gossip's going to be. This is what people are going to be saying. This is what they're going to talk about. They're going to talk about, the woman came to the threshing floor. And he says that we can't, it can't be. That's not all right. We can't let that go out there like that. Because that's not at all what happened here in this scene. But that's how people would probably naturally jump to assumptions. So one of the things that happens here is, I don't love this right here, the word let. It's rendered in all of our English Bibles as that's what's called a jussive. So it's let this happen or let that happen. And there's not a separate Hebrew form for the jussive. You just have to make that determination based on the syntax, which is determined by the context. And I think that what that does here, there's nothing wrong with rendering it as a jussive, but it just doesn't really help to clarify the passage, because that's what I think throws off so many of the commentators, is that they read it that way and they say, okay, so who was Boaz talking to? It kind of adds confusion. And so then they'll speculate about maybe Boaz was addressing a nearby servant that we don't know about. Maybe this was a prayer. Maybe he's addressing the Lord. And I think this is really not either of those. It's just he's talking out loud. And he's stating the obvious that this is going to be a problem if this is the talking gossip that gets out there. And so Boaz, what we see in this statement of him just talking out loud, is he's very concerned for Ruth's reputation. He wants to protect her from the town gossip. And he's going to back up this statement with very clear actions of how he's going to protect her reputation. Verse 15, and he said, bring the shawl that is on you, so probably some kind of a loose garment, but we're not exactly sure the specifics on this particular garment. He says, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley. We're not sure, it just says pieces of barley. Like, we're not sure exactly what that unit of measurement was, but he laid it on her. Then she went into the city. So Boaz, he starts taking practical action here. So what, and I think that's actually, the Hebrew text says he went into the city, and so a lot of the translations, you'll see it mixed. Some of you might have he or she in your Bible, because some of the translators make the decision, well, based on the context, this sounds like what Ruth is doing. Really, either work. They're both departing at some point or another, but I would go with he. That seems to be what the text, the majority of the Hebrew text would indicate. So Boaz, departs to go into the city after this plays out. But what's going on here is Boaz is worried about Ruth's reputation. That's what he's just stated very clearly in the previous verse, and now he backs it up. Because if she is going to walk back into the city empty-handed, that's odd. That's going to raise suspicions. But if she is carrying grain, on her back or on her head maybe, as they do in many parts of the world, however she's carrying this grain, she looks like she's just a hard worker. She looks like she's just been working hard, working into the night, getting a lot of grain together, and she's bringing it back home. She just looks like she's carrying something just like anybody else would carry anything back into town. It gives her a purpose to be basically engaged in commerce. So it helps her with her reputation, but it also has a twofold purpose, and the secondfold purpose is Boaz recognizes an opportunity to further bless Naomi. That he can have Ruth take back all this, newly ground or threshed grain, so he can stock her pantry. And so you just see so much from the character of Boaz here in this instance. So he's going to send Ruth back home in the early hours of the morning, and she's just going to look like anybody else, just carrying her merchandise back home, or her, the fruit of her labors. And so what we see here, I like this quote from Warren Wiersbe. He says, Boaz not only calmed Ruth's fears and gave her assurance for the future, but he also met her present needs in a gracious and generous way. She hadn't asked him for anything, but he gave the grain to her because he loved her. He was demonstrating the kind of guy that he was and his care and concern and provision for Ruth. Let's look. Actually, we have a takeaway here based on this. You see that with Boaz, it was his humility, likely shaped by his own family story, that gave him the wisdom and compelled him to love his neighbor as himself. That's Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. That comes right on the heels, if you read Leviticus 19, of gleaning, of making provision for the poor among them in Israel. And then it says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's sort of the guiding principle, tying together all these various stipulations that God has built in there in the book of Leviticus. Because Boaz got to the heart of the law, he was able to apply the precepts of the law so perfectly that he was looking after his workers. He was helping them as the gleaners. He was making sure that there was plenty of gleanings for them to take home. Because he was putting this passage into motion, into practice, he understood the heart of the law. And so he was able to apply the stipulations, the precepts of the law according to his overall, overarching kindness, compassion, faithfulness, and love. He got it. And so God's will for us is that we also seek to know and to put into practice the example and teachings of Jesus, who also instructed us to love our neighbor as ourselves, citing this passage in Leviticus 19, in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke. Humility will enable us to treat our neighbors, treat others with kindness, compassion, faithfulness, and love, and that also is going to yield great wisdom in how we delineate things before us. So humility being a very key to getting to the heart of the Lord, getting to know our Lord Jesus. When he teaches something, how do we put that into practice? Let's move on to verse 16. So when she came to her mother-in-law, she comes from the threshing area just outside the city back into town. Probably the city gates are just kind of opening up for the day at this point. Is that you, my daughter? And she gets to come through the city gates. She looks like she's been working all night. She looks very industrious, carrying all this grain. Is that you, she said, is that you, my daughter? Then she told her that all that the man had done for her. So literally the wording is, who are you, my daughter? It's interesting because Boaz had asked her the same thing when he was spooked back in chapter 3, verse 9. He says, who are you? And Naomi uses these same words in a little bit different context, a little bit different nuance, but still the same words. It almost bleeds into her asking, I think the young people in their lingo, they like to say, what is it like? Give me the tea or something like that. Spill the tea. I don't know. I don't speak the Gen Z. Have a little fun with it. But she almost shifts this into the nuance of whose are you? How did it go? Tell me how this played out is what she's asking. The Spanish I like here, ki, which would be, I think, like, how'd it go or something like that. I don't know. How did I do with that? Anyways, it does capture that nuance. How did it go, my daughter? Or whose are you, my daughter? But the answer is kind of, are you still Ruth the Moabitess, or are you now Mrs. Boaz? Did this? Which direction did this go in? And the answer was, well, kind of both, but kind of neither. She's now somewhere in between being Ruth the Moabite widow and Ruth the Israelite. And boy, does she have a lot to tell Naomi. But then, so she relates all of this that we've just read about in these passages. I startled him, and he told me, he wanted to know, who are you? And I told him, and, this is what I'm seeking. And he said, just stay here for the night. And then he loaded me with all this grain. And so we're given all these details. And in fact, she, in verse, let's see, we'll move on here. But there's going to be a wrinkle here coming where we know that Boaz has mentioned this nearer relative, this closer redeeming relative. So this introduces this complication into the story. And so this begs the question, we'll just throw it out there for right now, but will Naomi, upon hearing this, which she, I think, already knew, try to advise Ruth to do some kind of an end run around the situation, to try to manipulate the situation with the nearer redeemer? Or is Naomi's advice to Ruth going to be to wait and let the Lord and Boaz handle it? Verse 17, and she said, these 6 ephahs of barley, Boaz, he gave me, and he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. So here, she actually quotes Boaz's words, which we haven't heard here before. Do not go to your empty-handed to your mother-in-law. So this is what Boaz is telling Ruth as he's loading her with this grain in her shawl garment. The word here is very fascinating, though. It's rekam in Hebrew, which is empty or empty-handed, and it's the exact same word that Naomi used back in chapter 1, verse 21 to describe her own emptiness, her own being empty. I've come back empty. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. I'm bitter and I'm empty. But now, Boaz says, don't go empty or empty-handed to your mother-in-law. So you start to see how this is all coming full circle for Naomi. And these are also the final words we have recorded from Ruth in this book, the book of Ruth. So a lot of people are going to be talking, things are going to be talking sort of about her and around her and her situation, but this is the last we hear from her directly. Another thing that we see here is, let's look at verse 18. Then she said, and here's the answer to that question that we posed just at the end of verse 16. What is Naomi's reaction going to be? And Naomi said, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day. So what she knows of Boaz, combined with everything that Ruth has just told her, she says, Boaz, he's going to be a man on a mission. He is going to keep his word. He is honorable, and he is going to be diligent to get right on this. So her words to Ruth here are very profound. Naomi understood Boaz's gift as a sign of his trustworthiness and his sincerity. And if you go back to Ruth chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, Naomi's prayer is about to be answered of of them finding rest in terms of a marriage context, Ruth and Orpah. And she advises Ruth very wisely here to trust Boaz. I think what's so profound here is that when we back up and we look at the earlier Naomi, the Naomi along with Elimelech and their sons who had bolted, who had left, who'd gone out of the promised land because circumstances were difficult, there was a famine in the land, and so they left. That Naomi at that point was impatient. She was of the perspective of taking action herself. And I think that Naomi is in that spot where she had to learn the hard way, and now she's learned the lesson. Not to just take action due to worry or impatience, not to try to help God out, not to try to manipulate the situation, not to try to fix things on her own, but due to the lessons learned in her own life, now she can give Ruth very, very wise counsel. She tells her, have faith, exercise patience, be still. Literally just sit. Shub is the word in Hebrew. He tells her sit, but it's rendered here sit still, which works. That's a good rendering. So God's will for us is that we understand that patience can be our greatest act of faith and obedience. It's also the hardest many times. Impatience, coming up with our own solutions, and rushing to do something, anything, rather than just being still, is likely to cause us to have to learn the hard way like Naomi did, the importance of trust and patience and just the ability to remain sitting still. So God can do miracles. We read the words of Jesus, humanly speaking, it's impossible. But with God, everything is possible. And so I think we see some tremendous growth here in Naomi. She's learned the hard way. She's learned the lesson, and now she can pass on that wise counsel to Ruth and to say, it's going to be all right. We're going to trust God with this. Don't run around town trying to manipulate things. Just sit. Just rest. And trust that God is at work. Trust the character of Boaz. Trust that God is working things out for you. Even though this situation began by seeming impossibly bad, overwhelming, when Naomi looked at the trajectory of her life, all she could see was it ending in disaster. But the thing is, God is the God who can intervene and save and rescue and do the impossible and do the miraculous. And so he's kind of the X factor, and now Naomi gets that. And she says, okay, God is clearly at work here. Just be patient and let this play out. So such a powerful lesson as we conclude here this section of conclude the chapter 3. And then we're going to see some more details as we pick up next time. But I think such a powerful example of just learning to wait, learning to trust, learning to operate as I think Naomi's learning to operate on faith and not by sight. Because sight would tell her, entering back into the town of Bethlehem, it's hopeless. But with God, it is not hopeless. You just never know. You never know what God can do. And I remember I'll just conclude with this, when we were going to church in Kansas City, we had a wonderful church, much like this church. It was called Northwest Bible Church, and if any of them are watching online, great congregation, and our pastor, Clay Bolin, is really a faithful, wonderful pastor, and I remember him teaching through the book of 1 Samuel, and that was the refrain that he would use as he was teaching that book, is you just never know what God is about to do. So I think that's a hopeful, optimistic place to leave us this morning, where Naomi didn't know. She didn't know what was around the corner, but God did. And so she's able to pass it along to Ruth. Just sit and wait and trust and see what God's going to do. Let's close in prayer, and then we will have our final song this morning. Father, thank you for this passage, this wonderful book of Ruth. and just the opportunity that we have to go through it verse by verse, taking our time working through it, and to observe what you have to teach us through it, and what we need, the principles that we need to take and to apply. Thank you for the example of Boaz, a man who got to the heart of your word, and he understood, and he was able to have that really human perspective of compassion, of getting to the point, the heart of those stipulations in the law, the principles underlying them. Lord, may we have that kind of a personal faith in you as well, that's not just theoretical, theological, technical, mechanical, whatever, but one that's personal. And also, Lord, may we take this example from Naomi's life and the hard lesson that she had to learn of not trying to take matters into her own hands, but being able to trust you. I pray, Lord, that you would do that great work in all of our lives, that you would help us to be people that can be patient and to be okay with the fact that it doesn't look good on the surface, but we just never know what you're about to do, and to have that patience and that trust, to put our trust in you and to wait patiently on you. We ask your blessing now on each one of us as we make application of these things. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.